There are some stories that don't begin with a scream. They begin with silence, with the sound of rain tapping gently on an old church roof, with the rustle of wet coats as people kneel down, quietly, under the flickering candlelight. Hello, dear friend. Tonight, you've found your way here, to a story not of ghosts or shadows, but of something quieter, something you may have once felt deep in your chest. A warmth, a peace, a presence you couldn't explain. This is the story of a rosary left in the rain. A story that doesn't try to prove anything, but perhaps, just maybe, it will remind you that heaven sometimes whispers, and grace can fall like raindrops. My name is Nathan, and this is Fogman Stories Catholic, where we gather to listen to true spiritual tales from across the world. Stories of faith, mystery, and the unseen threads that tie heaven to earth. If you believe that there's more to this life than what we see, if you've ever lit a candle for someone you love, if your heart still stirs when you hear the name of Mary, or the soft rustle of rosary beads, then you're in the right place. Take a moment now to subscribe to this channel, so you don't miss the next quiet miracle. You never know which story might speak directly to your soul. Go ahead, I'll wait a moment. Done? All right, let's begin. This happened in a small village in northern Italy, a place where cobblestone streets still echo with footsteps after Mass, where old women still bake bread for their neighbors, and where the church bells ring even when no one is there to listen. One evening, under a sky swollen with clouds, a small group of people gathered for a rosary prayer. They did not expect anything strange. They had no idea what would happen next. As the rain began to fall harder, someone saw it, a string of rosary beads, lying in the middle of the courtyard, glowing, faintly, quietly, as if it had waited there for someone to notice. They picked it up, and something happened, something no one could explain. They said it felt like peace, a deep, inexplicable calm, the kind of peace that doesn't come from words, but from presence. And this is where our story begins. A rosary, the rain, and a grace that no storm could wash away. Chapter 1: The Stormy Evening. They said San Velario was built on prayer. Once, long ago, this tiny town in the hills of northern Italy pulsed with a kind of quiet devotion. The kind you could feel in the way shopkeepers crossed themselves when the bells rang. The way old women lit candles before the sun rose. The way the smell of incense never quite left the air, even after Mass was over. But times change, faith weathers, and lately, it seemed, San Velario had forgotten how to pray. We still had our old church, St. Isidore's, perched at the top of the cobbled road like a stubborn sentinel. Its bell tower leaned just slightly, its stones darkened with age and rain, but fewer people climbed that hill on Sundays now. The pews sat emptier each week. Even the candles seemed to flicker with less certainty. I hadn't been there myself in a long while, not since my husband passed. 3 winters ago, his name was Matteo, a quiet man, a carpenter, the kind who prayed more with his hands than his lips. He built most of the wooden benches in the church, including the one where I always sat, 4th row from the front, left side. After he died, I couldn't bear to sit there without him. I suppose I drifted, like the others, until the evening of the rain. It had started with a letter, simple, hand-signed by Father Enzo and pinned to the notice board outside the bakery. Community Rosary. This Friday at dusk, let us return to the heart of prayer. Rain or shine, rain or shine, he'd written. It made me smile at the time. Enzo was always like that. Brave, stubborn. He was not a young man anymore. But something in him refused to grow tired, while the rest of us pulled away from God in quiet hesitation. He only leaned in closer. Perhaps that's what drew me back. That Friday, the sky darkened early. The air smelled heavy, like wet stone and something deeper, like wood smoke and longing. Clouds rolled over the hills like slow-moving waves, and thunder murmured somewhere in the east. But I wrapped myself in Mateo's old coat and started the climb to the church. I wasn't the only one. By the time I reached St. Isidore's, maybe a dozen others had gathered under the narrow stone awning by the side entrance. We all wore that same look, half apology, half hope, like we weren't sure if we'd come for prayer or something we couldn't quite name. Father Enzo stood at the center, his cassock soaked at the edges, hair flattened by the drizzle, but his eyes were lit with something fierce. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice rising over the wind. "Tonight, we pray as a family, for ourselves, for those who have lost faith, and for those who never knew it." No one clapped, no one nodded, but no one left. We began the rosary just as the sky split open. The first Hail Mary rose softly, almost uncertain, as drops of rain began to tap against the roof above us. The second decade grew louder, steadier, as people stepped closer to one another, forming a loose circle under the cramped shelter. I stood near the edge, where the awning didn't quite cover the stone floor. Rain trickled in and soaked the hem of my skirt. But I didn't care. I had not prayed the rosary in over 2 years. The beads in my hands felt cold, unfamiliar, like a language I used to speak but had forgotten. Still, I followed. My lips moved, hesitant at first, then steady. Hail Mary, full of grace. The rhythm built with each prayer, until the courtyard echoed with voices, old and young, trembling and bold, layered one upon another like waves. It was then, somewhere in the middle of the fourth decade, that it happened. A flash of lightning tore across the sky, casting long shadows from the arches of the church. And for a moment, just a breath, I saw it. Something in the middle of the courtyard, lying still, out in the open, where the rain was falling freely. A rosary. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light. Perhaps someone had dropped theirs. But then came the thunder, deep, rolling, like a slow exhale of the earth, and in the lingering afterglow of the flash, I saw it again, not just lying there, glowing, faintly, as if each bead held a tiny ember inside, a soft, pulsing light, like a heartbeat in glass. I froze, my voice caught in my throat. The prayer stopped on my lips. No one else seemed to notice at first. The circle of prayer continued, a steady tide of devotion. But I was transfixed. There was something about it, something deeply unsettling, and yet familiar. I stepped forward without thinking. The rain hit me full on now, cold and insistent, but I barely felt it. My feet moved across the slick stone courtyard, one step at a time, toward the thing lying there in the storm. The rosary. It was silver, with dark blue beads, like droplets of midnight. The crucifix was simple, but finely made, and as I reached for it, I hesitated. I don't know why. There was no reason to fear a set of beads. And yet, something in my chest whispered, "This does not belong to you." But I took it anyway. The moment my fingers closed around it, something happened. The rain stopped, not outside. No, it still poured in sheets around me. But on me, around me, it fell silent. I was standing in the eye of some strange stillness, a pocket of silence. The world hushed, and then came the warmth. The rosary, wet and cold just a second before, began to heat gently in my hand, not burning but warm, like it had been resting on a sunlit windowsill. And with the warmth came peace. Not happiness, not joy, peace. The kind I hadn't felt since Mateo's funeral. The kind that slips into your bones and tells you, somehow, that you're not alone, that you are seen. I looked up, and everyone was staring at me. Father Enzo stepped toward me slowly, eyes wide. "Lucia," he said softly, as if afraid to break the moment. I held out the rosary. "I found this," I said, voice trembling. It was glowing. No one spoke. Then a child, little Carlo, the baker's son, whispered, "It's still glowing." And it was, even now, cupped in my hand. Under the stormy sky, the beads shimmered faintly with a bluish light. It was not bright. It was not theatrical. It was subtle, gentle, like a whisper. We did not finish the rosary that night, not in the usual way. We stood in silence around the glowing beads as the rain fell harder and the wind picked up. But no one moved. No one reached for an umbrella. The storm raged around us, and yet none of us felt cold. It was as if we had stepped out of time. I looked at the others, neighbors, strangers, faces I hadn't seen in months, and saw something I couldn't name. A softness, a breaking open. Some were crying, some were smiling, some looked like they had remembered something long forgotten. And in the center of it all, the rosary pulsed quietly in my hand. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Eventually, the storm passed, the clouds thinned, the wind died down, and someone, I think it was Father Enzo, said softly, "This is not just a rosary." That night, I placed it carefully on the small table by my bedside, next to my own old beads. I did not pray. I did not speak. I just sat, listening to the sound of water dripping from the roof, and the silence that followed. I cannot explain what happened that evening. I am not a visionary. I am not holy. I'm just a woman who showed up for a prayer in the rain. But something changed, and if you're listening to this now, perhaps you felt it too. That yearning for something beyond words. That deep ache for God to make himself known, not in thunder or fire, but in something smaller, something like a rosary left in the rain. Chapter 2: The beads on the ground. They say God doesn't shout, he whispers. And that night, standing in the rain-soaked courtyard with that glowing rosary in my hands, it felt as though we'd all just heard one of those whispers, quiet, unmistakable, and meant for everyone and no one at once. It was a strange stillness, The kind that doesn't come from silence but from a sense that something is watching, gently, lovingly, but watching nonetheless. For a long moment, no one said anything. The wind had slowed, the storm had softened to a quiet drizzle, and we all stood there, eyes fixed on the object that had brought us to an unexpected halt in our communal prayer. The rosary lay in my hand, beads still glimmering with that strange bluish hue. I could feel warmth from it radiating up my wrist, into my arm, not the heat of fire, but the warmth of presence, like when a child lays their head on your lap without a word. Comforting, quiet, whole. Then I heard a voice, small, hesitant, full of wonder. "Is that yours?" It was Carlo, the baker's son, standing not far from where I'd first spotted the beads. He must have been no more than 8 or 9, with wide brown eyes and wet hair plastered to his forehead. He looked not afraid, but curious, like someone staring at a candle for the first time. I shook my head. "No." "Then whose is it?" he asked. That question seemed to break the spell. People looked at one another, then down at their own hands as if making sure their rosaries hadn't gone missing. Some clutched theirs a little tighter. Others whispered uncertainly, "I don't think it was here when we arrived." Someone murmured, "I didn't see anyone drop it. It's so bright." Father Enzo stepped forward slowly, his boots squishing against the wet stones. His face was serious, but not stern, as though something deep inside him was moving. Uncertain but stirred. "Lucia," he said, nodding to me. "May I?" I opened my hands slowly. The rosary no longer glowed as it had a few minutes before, but a soft sheen still clung to the beads, like moonlight caught in oil. I half expected it to fade into ordinary light and be revealed as nothing more than glass and silver, the way dreams dissolve with daylight. But it didn't. It stayed just as it was, otherworldly in the most humble way. I placed it in Father Enzo's outstretched hands, and then something even stranger happened. He flinched, not a jolt, but a visible reaction, like a pulse had run through him from the beads up into his shoulders. He looked down at it with reverence and something like hesitation. Then he passed it gently to young Carlo, who was now standing directly beside him. "Here," Enzo said softly. "What do you feel?" Carlo looked up at him, unsure. "Can I?" "Of course." Enzo nodded. The boy reached out and took the rosary, and instantly, everything changed. I can't explain what happened in any rational way, but in that moment, the moment Carlo's fingers touched the beads, the air shifted. It was like a soft breeze had passed through each of us. Not wind, not weather, something inside. I saw it happen. Shoulders loosened, mouths opened in little gasps, and eyes welled up with tears for no clear reason. I myself felt it, a wave of calm so deep it nearly brought me to my knees. Not emotional, not dramatic, just peace, a clean, still silence that spoke louder than words. That said, "I see you. I know you. You are not forgotten." Carlo stood still, cradling the rosary in both hands as if it were something living. He turned slowly and looked up at me. Without a word, he stepped forward and held it out. "I think this is meant for you." I hesitated. "No," I said, "I only found it." "But you saw it," he said. His voice was calm, not the tone of a child seeking permission, but of someone stating a truth. You saw it before anyone else. I think it wanted you to." The words chilled me, not in fear, but in awe, like hearing a hymn in a language you didn't know you remembered. I reached out and took it back from him. Again, that gentle warmth flooded into my palms. And once more, the group shifted, soft sighs, tears blinking down cheeks, one man crossing himself slowly, reverently, as if he were before the Eucharist. I could barely breathe, not from fear, from something deeper, something sacred. It was Mrs. Giordano who cried first. She was an older woman, near 70, known for her practical nature and stern demeanor. I'd never once seen her emotional, but now she stood beneath the edge of the church awning, trembling, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. "I don't know why I'm crying," she whispered. Then another voice, a teenage girl beside her, "Me too." Then a man. It's like something let go inside me. People nodded, wiped their eyes. Some knelt on the wet stone floor without caring that it was soaked. And all the while, I stood there, holding the rosary, wondering what on earth had just touched us. Father Enzo remained quiet, his head bowed in prayer. His hands were folded tightly before him, knuckles pale, lips moving silently. I knew that look. It was the look he wore before elevating the host. Not fear, not confusion, reverence. Then, at last, he lifted his head. "This," he said, voice hoarse with emotion. "This is not by accident." No one responded. No one had to. We all felt it. "This isn't someone's lost beads." He continued, "This is a sign." He paused, then stepped closer to the group, lifting his gaze to the sky, now streaked with thinning rain and purple clouds. "We asked for nothing. We gathered to pray, nothing more. But heaven saw fit to answer, not with thunder or miracles, but with something small, humble, a whisper in the rain." He turned to me again. "Lucia," he said gently, "I believe you've been entrusted with something." My hands clenched slightly around the beads. They no longer felt foreign. They felt mine, not as possession, but as a calling. I nodded slowly. I didn't speak. I couldn't have. All I could do was hold them, this string of wet, shining mystery, and feel something inside me realign. Like a crooked frame suddenly righted, like a door long stuck quietly swinging open. We stayed there a while longer. Some resumed praying, their voices quieter now, each Hail Mary spoken with a gravity I hadn't heard earlier. Others sat in silence, heads bowed, letting the rain baptize them anew. Carlo remained by my side. "You know," he said softly, "my Nonna once told me that if Mary really wants to talk to someone, she won't do it with words. She'll just give them something to hold." I looked down at the rosary again, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel alone. That night, after the group dispersed, some reluctant to leave, others lingering with candles and whispered Avenue Marias, I walked home slowly, beads clutched in my palm. The rain had stopped, but the streets still shone with the reflections of street lamps and shuttered windows. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like every step I took was being watched, not by eyes, but by grace, by something or someone who had not forgotten us. Not San Velario, not me, not anyone. Chapter 3. The Whispers of Memory. Memory, I've learned, doesn't return like thunder. It returns like incense, slow, hurling, faint. A whisper in the air that only lingers if you stay still long enough. The morning after the rain, after that strange encounter with the glowing rosary, I awoke with my hands still curled around it. I hadn't meant to fall asleep that way, but it had never left my grasp. I remember sitting up, still wrapped in my husband's old wool blanket, and watching the first light of dawn catch on the beads. They no longer glowed the way they had in the courtyard, not visibly, but there was still something different about them. Something quiet, watchful. I didn't speak of it that morning. I didn't need to, because by the time I stepped out into the fog-chilled streets of San Velario, the village was already whispering. They called it the Rosary in the rain. They spoke of the light, of the silence, of how the prayers had felt different. And as word spread, something began to shift, not loudly, but unmistakably. More people showed up at the church that evening. Not for Mass, not for confession. They just came to sit, to pray, to remember. Father Enzo welcomed everyone, of course. He lit extra candles around the sanctuary, opened the side doors so the smell of the earth after rain could drift inside. He left out a guest book, but no one signed it. We weren't there to be seen. We were there to remember. It started simply enough. We'd gathered again in the courtyard, the rosary now sitting gently on a white linen cloth at the foot of the Marian statue near the chapel wall. The rain had passed, but everything was still damp, stones dark with moisture, the scent of rosemary and moss rising from the cracks. We sat on old wooden chairs, brought from the sacristy, arranged in a loose circle. It felt more like a vigil than a meeting. No one spoke at first. Then someone, I think it was the widow Maria, said softly, "May I share something?" Heads turned. No one stopped her. I hadn't touched my own rosary in 5 years. She said, eyes on the ground, "Not since my son died." I thought, if I prayed again, it would feel like begging. And I didn't want to beg. I wanted to be angry. She looked up then, eyes wet, but when Lucia held that rosary last night, I felt like someone had forgiven me, even though I never asked. Silence again, but a different kind, the kind that listens. That's when the stories began. It was strange, really, how quickly people opened. You'd think it would take more time. That confession is something you must pry loose with patience. But no, that night, it flowed. One after another, they began to speak of times they had prayed the rosary in desperation, of moments when they clutched those beads not out of devotion, but out of sheer survival. I listened quietly as the circle passed from voice to voice. Then came Agnes. She shuffled her chair forward, her cane resting against her knee, and cleared her throat in that commanding way only older Italian women can. "You want to hear a story?" she asked, lips curling slightly. "I'll give you one, but you must promise not to call it a miracle." We all smiled gently. She was known for her sharp tongue and sharper memory. "I was 16, she began, and the war was clawing its way up the mountains." Her voice dropped low, and the courtyard seemed to grow quieter with her. My brother Marco was conscripted. He didn't want to go. None of them did, but they were just boys with shovels and rifles. standing in mud where saints once walked. She paused, eyes distant, the day before he left. Our parish priest gave each of the boys a rosary, told them, if you can't pray with your lips, pray with your hands, and if your hands fail, hang it where heaven can see it. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled something out, a small, rusted military pin attached to a torn scrap of canvas. This was sewn to his cap, she said, and tucked behind it, stitched in secret, was the rosary. Her voice cracked for the first time. The day the shell hit, he was on patrol. Everyone else didn't make it. But Marco, they found him stunned, ears ringing, uniform torn, but alive. The rosary was still there, burned black in places, but intact. She let the silence sit. Don't call it a miracle, she whispered again, but tell me heaven wasn't watching. I don't know when the tears started falling, but they came freely from me, from others. Even Father Enzo dabbed his eyes with the edge of his sleeve. When I looked over at the glowing rosary near the statue, I thought I saw something flicker, not a glow exactly, but the faintest suggestion of light shifting across its beads, as if acknowledging the story. A shiver ran through me. My own story was next. I hadn't planned to share it. I hadn't said it aloud to anyone, not even in the confessional. But it came anyway. My husband, I said softly, Matteo, died 3 winters ago. Of pneumonia. I could feel my voice tightening. But I didn't stop. He'd worked with his hands his whole life. Never went to college, never read much. But he had this way of listening when I prayed. Like he was learning the words through me. I looked down at my lap. The last night, when the fever was too high, when the doctors had gone, I sat beside him, and I prayed the rosary, over and over, not asking for healing, not anymore, just not to be alone. The wind picked up just then, catching the edge of my scarf. And I remember, I whispered, on the final Hail Mary. His fingers moved, just a twitch, like he was praying with me. And then, he was gone. I didn't cry, not then, but everyone else did. The stories kept coming, of mothers praying while their children were missing, of prisoners clinging to prayer beads carved from soap and string, of strangers who once found a rosary on a bench, only to learn later it had belonged to someone recently passed. We weren't just remembering, we were returning to a time when prayer felt real, when suffering had shape, when God didn't feel so far away. Then Father Enzo stood. He'd been silent the whole time, eyes closed in contemplation. But now, as dusk began to settle, casting long shadows across the courtyard, he opened his eyes. There's a story, he said quietly, that even many locals have forgotten. It's not in any books. It's passed mouth to mouth, like wine at a funeral. He turned toward the Marian statue, candlelight flickering along her carved robes. In 1894, a shepherd boy named Paolo lived in these hills. His family was poor. He spent most of his days in the fields, watching sheep. The town didn't think much of him. He was simple, timid, not especially religious. One of the women crossed herself instinctively. But one night, Enzo continued, a storm rolled through the valley. Like last night, thunder, wind, rain that fell sideways. Paolo sought shelter under a tree. clutching the rosary his grandmother had given him, rough wooden beads, nothing special. He stepped closer to us now. They say lightning struck that tree, split it in two, and when the townspeople found Paolo the next morning, he was unharmed, lying on the ground, eyes open, clutching the rosary. Enzo paused, letting the words settle, but the strangest thing was the glow. Every person who saw him said the same thing. The beads were shining. A hush fell over us, and when the boy was asked what he saw, he said, "A lady in blue. She was smiling. She told me not to be afraid." The candles flickered harder now. People doubted, of course, called it a story, a child's fantasy, but the field where it happened, it's still there, and on certain nights, the old shepherds say, the light comes back. He looked at me then, at the rosary at my feet, and it looked, he said, just like that. No one spoke, because we didn't need to. Somewhere in our bones, we already knew this rosary wasn't ordinary. It carried something, a thread of memory, a thread of heaven, a soft, unspoken reminder that no suffering is wasted, that every whispered prayer is still echoing in eternity. As the sun set that evening, casting golden halos through the arches of St. Isidore's, I found myself holding the beads once more. They were just beads, and yet they weren't. They were stories, echoes, glimmers, and in the silence that followed, deep, reverent, alive, we all sat in the hush of memory and let heaven whisper. Chapter 4. The rain that kept falling. It would have made sense for us to go home. The rain hadn't stopped. If anything, it had grown steadier, not a downpour, but a cold, unrelenting mist that soaked through collars, trickled down backs, and left even the wooden church doors swollen and heavy with damp. And yet, no one moved. We were standing out in it, shoes damp, scarves limp, hands pruned from moisture, and not a single person had stepped away from the courtyard of St. Isidore's. Not even the elderly, not even the children. Looking back, I think we all understood, if not in words, then in instinct, that we weren't finished yet. The rosary wasn't finished with us. The white cloth beneath the statue of Our Lady was soaked through, clinging like skin to the stone base, and on it still lay the same chain of beads, the rosary that had glowed faintly in my hand the night before. That had stirred tears and stories from a dozen weary hearts. It no longer shone in the obvious sense, but it didn't need to. There was something about it, something that held us there, gently, the way a mother cups a child's face when they've wandered too far. I couldn't explain it, not then. I'm not sure I can now. But every time I glanced away from it, even for a moment, I found myself looking back, as if drawn, not like I was being watched, but like I was being invited. We gathered in a loose circle again, right there in the open. Some brought umbrellas but left them closed. Others laid out coats on the ground, makeshift kneelers against the wet stone. I stood without anything, no protection, no distance, my hands clasped tight, raindrops streaking my cheeks like tears that hadn't been earned. Father Enzo said nothing at first. Then, with the quiet conviction of someone who understood the strange workings of grace, he said, "Let's finish the rosary." A pause. Together, out here, as we are, And one by one, the others nodded. There was no ceremony, no organ music, no incense, no script, just a circle of villagers, tired, wet, imperfect, clinging to beads and prayer like lifelines. And so we began, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. I don't know if you've ever prayed the Rosary in the rain. It changes you. The water strips away everything, pretension, pride, posturing. You feel the ache in your knees, the shiver in your spine. You hear your voice more clearly when it rises against the sound of the storm. And still, you keep praying, because somehow, the discomfort becomes part of the offering. We went decade by decade, each mystery announced in Father Enzo's low, clear voice. His cassock clung to him like a second skin, and yet he looked more radiant than ever, not because of anything visible, but because of the peace that hung around him like warmth. As the raindrops struck our faces, we whispered each Hail Mary slowly, deliberately. There was no rush, only presence. Around the 8th decade, something began to shift. I noticed it first in the air, not in temperature or sound, but in texture. That probably makes no sense, but it's the only way I can describe it. The space around us softened, as if the courtyard were no longer made of stone and mortar, but of something more tender, thin, like a veil. The rain kept falling, but I hardly noticed anymore. My hands were locked in prayer. My lips moved with the others. And then, it happened. As we entered the final decade, Father Enzo announced the mystery, the coronation of Mary as Queen of Heaven, and just as the words left his mouth, the Rosary began to shine again, not with fire, not with brilliance, with light, pure, soft, undeniable. Each bead shimmered like the sky before dawn, a glow not seen but felt. The light didn't beam upward, didn't blind, it radiated outward, like the warmth of a fire you can feel even from the edge of the room. And then, slowly, it began to spread. The light moved across the courtyard, touching one face, then another. I remember it so vividly, the way it landed gently on the cheeks of young Carlo, who closed his eyes like someone basking in spring sunlight, the way it lit up the silver hair of Agnes, turning her into a living portrait of peace. Even I felt it, a glow that rose up from the soles of my feet to my fingertips, settling somewhere behind my ribs. It didn't make me shake or cry or gasp. It just stilled me. I glanced across the circle, and that's when I saw him. He hadn't been with us the night before. A young man, early 20s, maybe, standing near the back, soaked through, hoodie clinging to his frame. I recognized him vaguely. Luca, the youngest son of a man who'd stopped coming to Mass long ago. He was staring straight at the Rosary, lips parted. Then, without warning, he dropped to his knees. Not slowly, not gracefully. He collapsed, hands to the ground, forehead pressed to the stone, body trembling, not in fear, but in something else, something I couldn't name. Everyone paused. The prayers didn't stop, but they faltered. Eyes turned. Some gasped. Then Luca lifted his head, his face streaked with rain and something else, something ancient. I didn't believe anymore, he said, voice cracking. I didn't believe in anything. He looked directly at the Rosary. But just now, I felt him. His hand moved to his chest. Here, silence. Not because we doubted him, but because we knew exactly what he meant. We'd all felt it, that quiet touch, that holy weight, that presence so deep it carved space into your soul. No thunder, no visions, just a sudden knowing that heaven had leaned close. Father Enzo walked over to him gently, laid a hand on his shoulder, and said nothing, not a single word. He didn't need to. Instead, he returned to the circle, took up his rosary again, and the prayers resumed. This time, they didn't just feel like petitions. They felt like praise. The final decade unfolded in near silence, only the murmuring rhythm of the Hail Marys filling the space between raindrops. And when the last prayer was spoken, when the sign of the cross was made, no one moved, not for a long time. We stood there together, soaked and still, as if afraid to break whatever sacred silence had enveloped us. Even the birds had quieted. The bells in the tower remained still. Only the rain persisted, now gentle, almost reverent, as though it too had been transformed by the prayer. Tears mixed with water on cheeks. Hands gripped rosaries tighter, and then, slowly, without instruction, we each stepped forward, one by one, to stand near the glowing beads beneath Our Lady. Not to touch them, not to take them, just to be near, to let the warmth settle into our skin, to let the moment write itself onto our souls. That night, I did not sleep. I lay in bed, listening to the rain still falling outside my window, and I whispered the rosary again, this time with my old beads. And though they did not glow, though they remained as plain as ever, something inside me did, a small ember, quiet, steady, alive. Chapter 5. The Search for the Owner. The day after the courtyard prayer, the air smelled like soaked earth and old stone. It had rained through the night again, soft and unending, like heaven didn't want to stop whispering. The streets of San Velario were puddled and still. From my window, I could see ribbons of fog drifting low across the hills, slipping like ghosts between olive trees. It felt like something had been stirred and had yet to settle. I held the rosary in my hand that morning. It no longer shone like it did during our prayer. It was quiet now, still, but somehow its presence felt even more certain, like a gentle breath behind me as I moved through the house, or a hand resting silently on my shoulder when I paused too long in thought. I didn't speak to anyone that morning, but by afternoon, the church bell rang again, not for Mass, not for a funeral, not for celebration. It rang because we had a question. Whose rosary was this? It seemed only right that Father Enzo would try to find the owner. Somewhere, perhaps, someone was searching. Someone had dropped it unknowingly, unaware that it had become the center of a quiet spiritual tremor. Or perhaps not. Perhaps it had been placed. Father Enzo began with a list, every person who'd attended the prayer nights. One by one, they were asked, quietly, discreetly. No. They all said, "No, it's not mine. I brought my own. I saw it for the first time that night." He extended the search to the homes surrounding the church, elderly widows, reclusive artisans, even the innkeeper who hadn't set foot in St. Isidore's since his confirmation in the 1970s. Nothing. They visited the bakery, The grocer's, the woodworker's shop, still nothing. Then came the hospitals. There were 2 clinics within reach, one to the north, a smaller, worn-down facility with only 6 rooms, and another larger one 2 villages away. Enzo and 2 volunteers brought the rosary in a velvet-lined box, wrapped in white cloth, and spoke quietly with the nurses. "Has anyone lost something like this?" they asked. A few were intrigued, even reverent. Most simply shook their heads. One nurse brought out a cardboard box of unclaimed belongings, rosaries, watches, bracelets, wallets, but none resembled ours. Ours was different. Ours was unaccounted for. Back in San Velario, word began to shift. At first, it was practical. "Have you seen this rosary?" Then, it became personal. "Do you think it could be a sign?" And finally, it became something more whispered. "Do you think it belongs to someone who isn't alive?" That last suggestion came from old man Tullio. He was the oldest living member of our parish, 98. Mostly deaf, nearly blind in one eye, but sharp in ways that unsettled even the priest. I remember the day we asked him. He sat in his wooden chair outside his crumbling stone home. Sun had tilted low, cane resting across his lap. When Enzo showed him the rosary, he didn't even lift his hands. He just sniffed the air and said, "That's not a new thing." We waited. Tullio went on, as if seeing something we couldn't. "That doesn't belong to anyone breathing. Not now, maybe not ever." He closed his eye, the one that still worked, and added, "Some things are left behind on purpose." After that, we stopped asking, at least out loud. I brought the rosary back home that evening. There was no vote, no decision. It simply remained with me. Perhaps because I'd seen it first. Perhaps because I'd been the one holding it when everything shifted. I didn't feel ownership, only stewardship. I placed it on the small table near my bedroom window, where my husband's photograph sat beside a weathered statue of Our Lady of Sorrows. I folded the cloth beneath it and lit a candle nearby. And then I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I prayed the rosary, all 5 decades, aloud, for no one, for everyone. That night, I slept deeply, for the first time in 3 years. I didn't dream of hospital rooms or machines or the sound of Mateo's breathing slowing into silence. Instead, I dreamed of nothing, or maybe of peace. A wide, dark sky and silence, full as a cathedral. In the mornings that followed, I made it a ritual. I'd sit by the window with my tea, open the curtain to let in the gray light, and pray the rosary quietly while the fog still sat heavy over the town. Each day, I felt a little lighter, not happier, not healed, just less haunted. But the strangeness wasn't over. One night, during another quiet rain, I passed the table after extinguishing the candles. The room was dark, no moon, no lamps, and I saw it again. The glow, faint, gentle, not from a bulb or reflection. It was the beads, just a few of them, not the whole chain, lit as though someone had breathed soft light into their depths. I leaned in. They pulsed once, and then went still. I didn't speak of it, not to anyone. Some things are meant to remain between you and God. But I will tell you this. It happened again and again, not every night, not always the same beads. but enough times that I stopped doubting and began listening. There were no voices, no visions, but in those quiet hours, with the rain against the glass and the candle smoke still lingering in the air, I began to remember things I had buried. The sound of my husband's laugh, the texture of the old lace veil I wore on our wedding day, the lullaby my mother used to hum while brushing my hair. Not visions, but visitations, from memory, from something beyond memory. I began writing them down in a small leather journal, 1 page for each night. I didn't know why, but something told me I'd want to remember. One night, I awoke at 3 a.m., the hour of mercy, the old nuns used to say, and found my window wide open. I never sleep with it open, never, and yet there it was, letting in the soft breath of a wet spring wind, and beside the rosary, a single petal, white, fresh, no flowers in my home, none outside that bloom in March. I placed the petal inside the journal and said nothing. In time, I came to believe something I hadn't dared believe for years, that God was not silent, that He had never been silent. I had simply forgotten how to listen. When I next returned to the church, Father Enzo didn't ask where the rosary was. He didn't need to. He looked at me, really looked, and smiled. "You've been praying," he said. I nodded. "Good," he replied, "because it's not over yet." He was right. It wasn't. Chapter 6. The Healing. It started with whispers, not the kind that echo in alleyways or slip between gossiping mouths, but gentler, quieter, whispers that rose from the pews like incense, whispers that traveled in folded hands, in candlelit glances, in small, hesitant footsteps. People were coming, not in crowds, not all at once, but in trickles, like water finding its way down stone. They came not to gawk, not to question, they came to touch. Word had spread beyond San Velario. The story traveled faster than we expected, as stories of grace often do, born not on newspapers or radio, but on the backs of grandmothers and godparents and children who whispered. There's something at the church, something you can feel. They came because of a rosary, not because it glowed, though some said it still did, not because it healed, though there were rumors, but because it held something they were desperate to remember. Hope. I first noticed it one Sunday afternoon. I had come early to light candles before the statue of Our Lady. The nave was dim and golden, the sun falling through the colored glass like soft honey. As I passed the back pews, I saw them, a couple, young, pale with worry, holding the hands of a small boy who looked too tired for his years. They didn't speak, they only walked, slow, uncertain, to the small side altar where the rosary was kept now, beneath a dome of glass. And there, kneeling before it, they bowed their heads. The boy reached out, the mother whispered something I couldn't hear, and the rosary glowed. It wasn't dramatic, not a blaze, not a show, just a soft shimmer, a tremble of light beneath the glass. I watched the boy's hand stop shaking, and when he turned around, his eyes met mine. He smiled. They returned 3 more times that week. Each time, the boys slept through the night. It wasn't announced. No one claimed a miracle, but we all knew. Then came the woman with the swollen belly. She was due any day, but her face was drawn with fear. There had been complications, whispers of risk, doctors uncertain. She knelt for hours. No one disturbed her. She returned the next day, and the next. On the fourth day, she lit a candle and didn't say a word. She simply placed a tiny bundle of white cloth before the statue, the name Gianna stitched delicately on its edge, and wept. The stories accumulated like dust on the old altar wood. People began arriving from other towns, not in flocks, but in slow reverence. A farmer with an injured leg, a widow with no voice, a boy who hadn't spoken in 2 years. Not everyone was healed, but something always happened, always. They would touch the glass or pray nearby, and something would shift, not always in the body, but in the face, in the posture, in the light behind their eyes. Some stood straighter, some cried, some laughed softly, like remembering an old joke. I watched them all. Sometimes I stayed hidden in the shadows of the nave. Other times, I sat near the back with my journal in hand. I kept writing, recording the moments, recording the dreams, because the dreams had returned. They were always the same. A field, rain falling softly, not the kind that stings, but the kind that hushes the world. And in the rain, a woman. She wore blue, always blue, not the deep navy of morning, but a light, gentle blue, like the petals of the morning glory, or the old veils worn by nuns in my childhood parish. She never spoke. She only stood there, hands folded, watching me. Sometimes she was near, sometimes far, but always there, and always, behind her, the glow, not from the Rosary, from her. I never told anyone, not even Father Enzo, until one evening after Vespers, when he lingered by the chapel entrance and said gently, "You've been writing." I nodded. "I've seen things," I said, "in sleep, in the rain." He waited. "There's a woman," I whispered, "in blue. She doesn't speak, but she's there." He didn't ask what I thought it meant. He only said, "So has she always been." A few nights later, during a quiet vigil with only a handful of candles burning, I heard him address the people gathered. There were perhaps 15 of us, a few travelers, a mother with a sleeping child, a man with shaking hands. Enzo stood beside the Rosary, now encased in polished wood and glass, with linen beneath it and lilies beside it. And he said, "My dear friends, remember, it is not the beads that heal." The church was so quiet you could hear the rain sliding down the windows. "It is the one they point to." He placed a hand on the glass case. "We do not worship a string of pearls, but the mercy of a God who meets us in the smallest things, in wood, in water, in hands that tremble over prayer." His voice softened. "Do not cling to the object. Cling to the promise." Some bowed their heads. Others nodded, but no one left. They stayed and prayed, not to the Rosary, but with it. Later that night, in my journal, I wrote, "There is a difference between relic and reminder. This is not holy because it glows. It is holy because it reminds us how to see again, and how to ask without shame." The dreams continued. Each time I saw her, the woman in blue seemed to move closer. On the 6th night, she reached out her hand. I didn't take it, not yet, but I woke with a strange peace humming in my bones. I could hear the rain even after it had stopped. One morning, a little girl from the village knocked at my door. She said her grandmother was sick, and they didn't know what to do. She had heard I had the rosary that sings in the dark. I didn't correct her. Children always understand better than adults that God is not afraid to be beautiful. I gave her my own rosary, not the glowing one, but mine, the one I had used since I was a girl, the one I had nearly buried with my husband. She held it like treasure, and I realized that's what healing looks like. Not magic, not answers, but giving what little light we've been given to someone still in the dark. By the end of that week, people had started calling the Rosary La Benedetta, the Blessed One. It wasn't official, but in the hush of candles and murmured prayer, it became her name. I kept praying, I kept dreaming, and with every passing day, the ache in my chest, the one I didn't know I carried, lessened. Not disappeared, but softened, like a scar that no longer hurts when you press it. Some nights, the rosary glowed again, faint as breath. Other nights, it didn't, but the prayers never changed. And neither did the woman in blue. She waits, still, in the rain, with hands folded, and eyes full of something I'm only beginning to understand. Chapter 7. The Night Vigil. They say the night speaks differently when you're waiting for God. It moves slower, breathes deeper, and listens. I didn't sleep the night before the feast of Our Lady of the Rosary. Not out of anxiety, not even anticipation, but because something inside me, something old and quietly awake, knew that the story was reaching its final breath. Like the last bead on a string, the final amen. And so I sat by the window with the curtains open, watching the rain. It wasn't heavy, more of a mist that swept in waves across the street lamps, softening the sharp edges of the night, the kind of rain that doesn't fall on you, but around you, the kind of rain that feels like a presence. The vigil had been Father Enzo's idea, but I don't think anyone had to be persuaded. By then, the whole parish, and even villages beyond, had heard the stories. Some came with hearts full of longing. Some came out of curiosity. Some came because their grandmother had whispered, "You need to be there." And some simply came. We gathered just after sundown. The church bells tolled once, low and slow, and people began arriving. One by one, holding candles wrapped in wax-dotted paper cups. There was no shouting, no coordination, only reverence. Children with wool scarves tied under their chins, old men who had stopped going to church years ago, mothers holding sleeping babies, young seminarians in borrowed raincoats, teenagers walking behind their parents, half embarrassed, half intrigued. No one wore white. We were cloaked in gray, in fog, in rain, in the mystery of something unexplainable yet completely real. The courtyard had been swept clean that afternoon. A circle of folding chairs had been arranged around the Marian statue where the Rosary, La Benedetta, now rested beneath a clear glass dome. Dozens more would stand, or kneel, or simply listen. There were no microphones, no loudspeakers, only voices and candles. The vigil began with the litany of the Blessed Virgin, slow, rhythmic, the responses rising like breath in cold air. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us. Tower of David, pray for us. Comforter of the afflicted, pray for us. It went on, line after line, until the names stopped sounding like titles and began sounding like memories, fragments of every moment we had needed her and had forgotten to say so. Then came the Rosary. We prayed slowly, intentionally, each beat a step, each Hail Mary a knock on heaven's door. Rain dripped from the eaves. Shoes squeaked gently on wet stone. But no one shifted, no one yawned. The Salve Regina came next. That ancient hymn, older than all our doubts, stronger than all our grief. Salve, Regina, Mater Misericordiae. Our voices trembled on the Latin, not from unfamiliarity, but from love. Then I heard my name, softly, from Father Enzo. He nodded toward the lectern they'd set up near the statue. "Would you read the prayer of intention?" he asked. I froze. I had no speech, no paper, only the steady ache in my chest. But I stood, and I walked, and as I stepped into the center of the courtyard, surrounded by rain-soaked hearts and flickering flames, something broke open inside me. I opened my mouth, but before the words came, I felt it, the embrace, not arms, not hands, but something behind me, warm, invisible, unmistakable, wrapped around my shoulders. A pressure, a weightless presence, gentle as breath. I gasped softly, and tears sprang instantly to my eyes. There was no one there, but I knew. I began, voice cracking. "I want to thank you." I wasn't speaking to the people. I was speaking to the presence, to the one who doesn't abandon us, even when we abandon ourselves. My voice grew steadier, to the mother who stands in the rain and waits, to the one who turns silence into song, to the God who teaches us to hope through repetition. I looked down at the Rosary beneath the dome. It shimmered once, not a glow, but a sigh of light. To all who are tired, who are angry, who have stopped praying, I paused. "Come back." That was all I said. I stepped down, wiping my face, heart pounding. No one applauded, but everyone understood, because we had all felt it. Then it happened, as the final Hail Mary of the final decade was spoken. A light, soft, gentle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, not from a lantern, not from the candles, from the statue. A subtle glow surrounded the figure of Mary, beginning at her veil, cascading down her robes, pooling at her feet like moonlight. The Rosary at her base began to glow too, faint at first, then clearer. Each bead lit like a heartbeat. One, then another, then another. It pulsed, steady and sure, like the rhythm of prayer itself. Every candle flickered in response, though there was no wind. No one said a word. No one dared. We watched, as if we were looking at something both deeply holy and heartbreakingly familiar. Then the light dimmed, the beads went still, and the rain stopped. We remained in silence for a long while. Some knelt, some wept, some simply stared upward into the now clear night, as if trying to memorize the shape of the silence. Then people began to leave, quietly, candles still burning, hearts still open. I was the last to go. I waited until the courtyard emptied, until Father Enzo nodded to me once and disappeared inside, and I stood before the Rosary. One last time, I whispered, "Thank you," then turned and walked home. The next morning, when I returned to the church to light the first candle of the day, I saw it immediately. The dome was empty. The rosary was gone. No one had taken it. No one had touched it. No one knew when it disappeared. It had simply finished its work. Some searched, some speculated, but I didn't, because I knew some things come when we need them. Some things stay just long enough to remind us how to pray. And then they return to where they came from. The rosary was never meant to be kept. It was meant to be remembered. That night, the rain didn't fall, but in my dreams, it did, and the woman in blue stood beneath it, smiling, waiting, watching, and as I reached out to her, she nodded, just once, as if to say, "You're ready now." Chapter 8. A sign of grace. Grace does not always come in grand gestures. Sometimes it comes as a memory, a light that faded, a silence that stayed. Sometimes it lingers long after the miracle has passed, not in the eyes, but in the rhythm of the heart. That was how it happened in San Velario. In the weeks after the vigil, everything changed, not dramatically, not all at once, but like spring waking after a long sleep, quiet, persistent, certain. People began to return, not because the rosary was there, but because something inside them remembered. Mass attendance doubled by the next Sunday. The pews that had gathered dust were suddenly filled again, not with tourists or seekers of signs, but with people who belonged here all along. Men who hadn't knelt in 20 years did so with trembling hands. Mothers taught their children to cross themselves again. Teenagers lit candles without being told why. The confessional line wrapped around the wall of the church for the first time in decades. And when the bells rang, they rang through the valley like they had something worth announcing again. I watched it all unfold like one watches a garden slowly turn green. Not with noise, but with hope. Some mornings, I would arrive early, before the sunrise, before even the sacristan had unlocked the side door, and I would sit quietly on the old stone bench near the Marian statue. The dome was still there, but the rosary was not. Only lilies now, and the memory of a light that once lived there. And that was enough. I still prayed the rosary, every day, but not with La Benedetta, not anymore. She was gone, returned to wherever heaven keeps the things it lends. Instead, I used my old beads. The same worn chain I had nearly thrown away after Matteo's death. The same set I had clung to through tears and silence and those endless nights when faith was only a whisper. They were simple, dull in color, a little chipped, but now they glowed in a different way. Not with light, but with story. Every morning, I would begin, in the name of the Father. And as I prayed, I would remember the courtyard, the rain, the candles, the boy who knelt, the woman who gave birth, the dreams of the lady in blue, and I would whisper beneath my breath, not aloud but with all my heart, "Thank you." Some days, I caught myself looking out the window, half expecting the rosary to reappear, just sitting there on the table like it had never left. But it never did, and that, I've come to realize, was the point. It wasn't meant to stay. It was meant to pass through us, to press itself into the flesh of our memory like a seal, to soften us, to call us back. One afternoon, while sweeping the chapel floor, I found a note tucked beneath a pew. It was folded carefully, no name, no date, just one sentence, written in a child's shaky hand. I touched it and I knew God saw me. I stood there holding that scrap of paper for a long time. Then I placed it inside my journal, right next to the petal from the night the window blew open. The town spoke less and less of the Rosary as time passed. Not because they forgot, but because they didn't need to keep repeating the story to remember it. It had settled inside them. It had become part of them. Like breath, one evening, as the bells rang for Vespers, Father Enzo approached me with a stack of handwritten pages. "I've written it all down," he said. I smiled. "All of it?" He nodded. "Every word I could remember. Every moment I witnessed. Every name. Every prayer." He looked toward the statue. "I'm sending it to the bishop. Not as a request, not for recognition, but for truth." I nodded. "They'll ask for proof." "I know," he said softly, "but we don't need to convince them." He handed me the top page, and I read the last line. It said, "We did not ask for a sign, but God gave us one, small, quiet, and full of grace, right in the middle of an ordinary storm." I don't know what the church will say. Perhaps they'll call it a private devotion. Perhaps they'll call it coincidence. Perhaps they won't say anything at all. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And I know what I became. These days, I rise earlier than ever. I light a single candle. I hold my old rosary. And I pray. Sometimes I hear the rain on the roof. Sometimes I don't. But always, always, I feel her. The woman in blue. The silence. The invitation. The peace. She doesn't appear in dreams anymore. Because she doesn't need to. She is in the rhythm of the beads, in the soft echo of every Ave Maria, in the presence that lives not in the object, but in the prayer. So now I carry her, not in my hands, but in my heart. And when someone asks what happened here, I don't tell them about the glowing rosary. I tell them this: there was rain, and we prayed, and heaven answered, not in thunder, but in grace. There are stories that don't need answers, only remembrance. Rosary in the Rain is one of those stories, not because of a glowing rosary or whispered miracles, but because it reminds us that grace still moves in the quiet corners of the world. That prayer still has weight. That faith still finds its way home. And maybe that we are never truly praying alone. Thank you for sitting with us through this journey of rain, memory, and silent healing. If this story touched something in you, even gently, we invite you to stay. There are more stories waiting, more whispers in the dark. So please, consider subscribing to Fogman Stories Catholic, where faith meets mystery, and the unseen becomes unforgettable. Until next time, stay warm, stay listening, and never be afraid to pray again.